Hey everybody, how you doing? This is Bill Manning. So today's gonna be slightly different than our usual kind of JFrog Artifactory intros or anything like that. It's gonna be very conceptual. It has to do with what I think a lot of questions that I get on a regular basis about how to utilize JFrog and Artifactory best in your CI/CD system, and we'll go through that today. I'm Bill Manning. As I stated before, I'm one of the solution architects here. It says solution engineer, but whatever. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm available on there. But really what it comes down to is that I listen to a lot of customers. I talk to a lot of customers on a regular basis. I do trainings. I do webinars. I go in front of the public, help define the product architecture and roadmaps for everything going forward. So I wanted to kind of share my knowledge out there and have it so that when people are utilizing Artifactory and our other products, by the way, also, that there's an understanding of what you can do and how you can utilize it best. So a mentality I want you all to kind of pull in before we get started on this is I always like to say when I talk to people is that you should always picture DevOps as being a producer-consumer model. And that in terms of where Artifactory comes in, is that if you're a producer of binaries, you have consumers somewhere. Now, those consumers could be externally. It could be end users where you're creating, say, maybe iPhone or Android applications, or you're building libraries that are used in your organization for other teams. And then, even down to, like I said, deploying services where you're building a continuous integration and continuous deployment using things like Docker, Kubernetes, or anything like that. Artifactory, we're basically platform agnostic. We handle, many different types of platforms from on-prem to hybrid, where you might be on-prem in a cloud instance and all the major cloud providers. But we're not really here to talk about that. What we're here to talk about today is, I call it, the source of truth and understanding. What does that actually mean for you as a DevOps engineer who's been tasked with utilizing Artifactory and as all the other components that are along with it, in addition to some best practices and some things to keep in mind. So if you were looking for some way to have a click through, where I'm going to click through a bunch of stuff and show you one, piece by piece by piece, this may not be the part for you. But at the same time, if you're looking to have it so you can see where I'm actually clicking on stuff and talking about the basic usage and characteristics behind it, then this is for you. DevOps, whenever people talk about DevOps, myself personally, even down to this respect, if you're friends with the IT crowd, you understand this is what it feels like most of the time. You're running an organization, you're trying to keep everything going, you're making sure that everything is coalescing nicely. And the whole thing is that no matter how much you automate, no matter how much time and effort you spend in, you're always going to have those edge cases. And wouldn't it be nice if you had some way to shuffle those binaries through your system with that being the least of your concerns? Well, that's where we come in. And over time, binaries have grown from in the beginning, especially as, different varying aspects of software development. We always like to say in the company, and it's not just us, but others too, that every company is a software company. If you look at the breadth of customers that we have inside of JFrog, we have everything from cruise lines down to auto manufacturers, down to devices, you name it. And also too, over time, we talked about the explosion of binaries is because as microservices became more adept, towards the top end of this, it all started with Agile, CI/CD. It's this evolution of where DevOps, before even the term DevOps, in the mid 2000s, late 2000s, came about. It's always been about software that's being produced and how it's handled. But wouldn't it be nice, like I said, to have some sort of infrastructure below this that acts like, think of it as like a conveyor belt. As you go stage by stage by stage, and every point along this, along that process, you create binaries and you manage binaries, and this is where the kind of things we're addressing in this. Of course, your typical CI/CD pipeline. If you're watching this, I really don't have to go into too much depth. This is the typical continuous circle idea. People have it so that you learn, you code, you build, you release, you run it. You go through the cycle. You would also, now you can start throwing in things like, people like the term, and this becoming more apparent, this is like DevSecOps, where you might actually have the security aspect in between your dev and your ops modes. And, JFrog, we have X-Ray, which can help you in that respect also. And we could talk a little bit about that as part of the hands-on demo information that I'm going to show you. So this is your typical kind of flow that you would have. You have a developer who develops code. He checks his code in, into GitHub. He has Jenkins that performs automated tasks. Whether he builds locally, then does it then, or when he checks his code in and Jenkins or any CI server. I'm just talking about Jenkins because it seems it's one of the most commonplace ones. But we also handle Circle CI, Travis. We also have Microsoft suites. With VSTS and TFS. But the main thing you can have between that is Artifactory. Now I have bin tray here located for distribution and X-ray for vulnerability scanning, but let's focus on Artifactory today. Now, when people also ask me, what value does Artifactory bring into your development scheme for, DevOps across your organization? Number one, I say simplicity. Simplicity is a way for you to implement Artifactory into existing projects or new projects that allows you to have consistency, which is the second part of this. Consistency meaning that the binaries that are like external dependencies and the binaries that the developer is developing are the same ones that are being utilized maybe through your entire CI/CD pipeline. When it's going from that developer to, say, that automated build testing stage to a QA phase to maybe a vulnerability scanning phase to, a proof point in QA of like a gold release and then the release itself. The consistency allows you to, worry, less about, it works on my machine. What Docker solved in terms of doing something like in the ways of 12 factors of saying, you never develop on your own machine. You develop in an environment that is as close, is almost identical to your production environment. Well, transporting those binaries across the entire scheme of that will allow you to use Artifactory correctly. One of the things that we're going to cover in this concept, by the way, in this talk, and I'm going to go in, is something that I always bring up to customers, and a lot of people aren't aware of it, but we'll talk about the promotion API. So when we've talked about these steps and stages, we'll talk about how you can utilize the promotion API in addition to metadata to basically bring this to a full circle of where, like I said, a conveyor belt, a plumbing system, whatever you want, whatever magic metaphor you want to throw out there to describe what we do, we can help you in that respect. So we talked about this, it's a place where you can manage all your binaries in one location. And the thing is that we will go through when I give the demo later on, I'll show you all the vast number of types that we actually support. We're growing on a regular basis. We have some that are coming out. Our latest release, we introduced Go. So if you are a Go developer, we have a Go repository. Right before that, we introduced our Helm chart repository for people who are doing Kubernetes. And in fact, we are basically the first repository for Helm out there. It's a way for you to go through and install the artifacts you have. Like I said, not just the dependencies for these builds, but the actual builds themselves. A lot of our customers, when they integrate into their CI platform and they actually take the builds and they promote them up into Artifactory, it gives them a source of record. And I'm going to show that. I'm going to show some of the powerful features behind that on how you can utilize the tools that we provide for remediation even. And one of the examples I'll give is how hard it is to look at a Docker container if something fails, and how do you tell what's changed between those Docker containers without extensive research. But utilizing Artifactory, we can help you in that respect. As a proxy for your remote repositories, when we say that is that we're going to discuss three types of repositories here today. We're going to talk about local repositories, remote repositories, and virtual. Now, local repositories are going to be the binaries that matter to you, but the remote repositories is where you're proxying the dependencies that are being pulled by your developers, and you're caching them. Now, that allows to have replay value when your developer develops something, they build it, they pass it off to their CI/CD system. Even in the CI environment, it's the same dependencies that your developer used are the same dependencies that are being utilized in your Jenkins or in your CI build. And also, too, it also works as a great dependency manager, like I said. So if you have things, if you guys can flash back, if you're a Node developer, you remember a couple of years ago, the infamous left pad issue, where a disgruntled Node developer got rid of 12 lines of code called pad left. When they got rid of that, it broke a tremendous amount of builds. Well, Artifactory customers were actually saved by this because we actually had a cached version of that. There's plenty of information out there about that, so I'm not going to go too deep into it, but that's the kind of thing that actually Artifactory provides you. Now, the other thing too is that having that will satisfy a lot of other things. We have a lot of fintech. We have a lot of companies that have regulations behind them, that have governance boards behind them. Well, having Artifactory in your midst will help you do that, by banning licenses and looking at, any sort of, open source development things that you're utilizing. We have those pieces behind there. It allows you to have reproducible builds. Other thing too is that since there is a tremendous amount of metadata that's produced by these builds, utilizing that metadata and enhancing that metadata so that it's actually more appropriate for your system is actually a really huge contribution to what can be done to your CI pipeline, your CI system, and your DevOps in general. Metadata is power, and I'm going to talk about that also. And also, too, you're not dependent on a single source of truth out there, right? So you're not dependent on that external dependency or repository like NuGet packages and stuff like that. You now can actually pull that and actually also create your own set of repositories on things that matter to your organization. So what can you store inside? Well, you can store things like builds, and there's access permissions, licensing, signatures, and then, like I said, custom metadata is key. So we always talk about from developer to deployment. So if you're looking, at the grand scheme of things, we call this the football, or you want to call it the rugby ball, or you want to call it the American football. I don't care. Whatever you want to call this shape, you can call it a spaceship if you wanted to. What we have here is we're the sweet middle ground in the middle, if you want to look at it that way. So the thing is, you have your source control. We don't do source control. We've never claimed to do source control, but we do the dependencies that source control depends on. So you have Git for your source control, you have CI, we put Jenkins here just because, but once again, it can be any CI/CD environment. Now in the middle here, we have our various product lines. We have Mission Control and Insight. Mission Control is a way for you to manage all your Artifactory deployments across your organization. X-Ray, of course, is our security vulnerability and scanning. Artifactory is your binaries. JFrog bin tray is actually our SaaS solution, in which you are actually taking that and putting it out there. It rides on top of Akamai's CDN for distribution. We also have in our Enterprise Plus product for JFrog, we have our own version called Distribution, in which you can actually roll your own CDN with our distribution node. And we also have a concept of edge nodes. Those edge nodes can be placed in any place where you find necessary. And then last but not least, Access. So Access is our layer that actually coalesces all our products together under a common security layer. Now, the security layer, we'll kind of talk about security in a little bit, but you don't have to use our user schema. You can use things like LDAP or Okta or OAuth. And then last but not least, one of the things, if you look at the end, I've got Kubernetes, but it doesn't have to be Kubernetes. It can be any other sort of services architecture that managed to you. It could be any sort of end release where you actually push out your software to your customers. We're that sweet spot in the middle. And think of us as a suite that underlies everything you're trying to do, so you can focus on innovation and not on infrastructure. So one of the main things that you need to get in your head initially when you start thinking about Artifactory, and this is very important, and the reason why I made this one of the first things I talk about, is how artifacts are stored in Artifactory. Just so you understand, we use a checksum-based storage, and that has a lot of benefits behind it. Now, when I say that is because, we always get the question is, I've got large scale images, I've got large binaries that I'm pushing up, things like that, parts that I'm putting through. Well, one of the things that we do is we use a checksum-based storage, and that allows like deduplication, speed, accuracy, efficiency in terms of search, retrieval, and lots of other ways that it comes about. But the thing is, say I have a common library that's used across my organization. Let's call it auth 2.4.6. I have 1,000 projects in my org, and that 1,000 projects in my org all use it. Well, we only store that once, and everything else is referenced via metadata. So that allows you to have that speed, accuracy, and efficiency. Also, too, the difference between having like a, we've heard customers say, well, I store everything right now in an NFS that I share across my company, and that's great. And what we do is we tell customers when they want to migrate over, we give them our CLI tool, which we'll discuss today also. And we say, well, you can upload all that, all those binaries out of your NFS into Artifactory. And we've had many customers call us up and say, I had 8 terabytes or 6 terabytes of binaries in my NFS. I brought them into Artifactory, and I only have 1.4 terabytes of data. And we look and then we check the system of record, and we let them know, they're like, no, they're all there. It's just that you had a tremendous amount of duplicates. And by using like our CLI, which is also checksum aware, it won't upload what is already there. It'll create another reference pointer, thus adding to your speed and efficiency. That's kind of the reason why I want you to have that mentality that when you're looking at this, that this is not only just a, there's reasoning behind why your organization went with Artifactory, why your organization is, adding this into its, into its tool chain, or you're actually contemplating whether this is right for you. But these are just kind of things that, I could have shown you a straight up demo where I'm clicking around and showing things, and I'll do that. But I want you to make sure that your mind is in the proper place so that you understand what I'm showing you and the concepts behind it. And it always makes it easier for implementation. So like I said, deduplication, moving is as simple as moving metadata. This also helps, by the way, in terms of efficiency with uploads, downloads, and replication. We'll talk about the varying types of replication for, say, multi-site topologies. Now, by the way, just always keep in mind all the stuff I'm discussing today. We have webinars, we have white papers, we have our wiki. We are more than happy. If we don't have it, you can ask for it. And we love to listen to our community. And, that's how we built an organization like we have. By the way, we also say file system performance, because like I said, with deduplication, by using the metadata as a way to search for those binaries instead of through a file store, you get much better performance. And also too, we talk about freedom of layouts. One of the things we could talk about a little bit today, but like I said, I'm going to be touching on these points, and we have all this information available in white papers and on our wiki. But layouts, so in other words, you might actually decide that a library needs to be stored in a certain path, certain layout, and you have that freedom to do that. You have the ability to change that path to work with your organization best. And I can't emphasize enough the whole idea of it's all about metadata, because the thing is that not only is it the metadata that's produced by your systems, it's the metadata behind the binaries, whether they're the dependencies or the ones that you're getting, but also too being able to customize it and to build a system around you that actually represents your environment, your organization, by adding metadata that manages, that matters to your org. It doesn't have to be preconceived. It doesn't have to be pre-notioned. It could be what matters to you. So in other words, you might have internalized numbering structure. You might have approval paths. You might have things that matter to you that, having the ability to take this lump of clay about Artifactory and mold it into your organization so it matters to you most, gives you the most reliable source of truth that matters to you. And that's where the power lies. When you're working with metadata, being able to do that, you can do it automatically through CI/CD. So I'm going to show you some examples of that on how you can automate this, how you can go through and do, additional functions and features and checkpoints and proof points or whatever you want to do. And then also how to utilize our AQL. A lot of people that we know and we talk to aren't aware of the Artifactory query language and the power that that possesses. And I'm going to show you some CI examples of that on how you can utilize, a detailed query language searches in Artifactory to produce solid and stable releases by looking for tags and looking for other metadata to make sure that what is being pushed down is what matters to your org. Now, one of the other things, now we're going to expand out. Now, let's say you're a global organization, right? So Artifactory fits into that also. So by having, say, Artifactory in multi-site, multi-regions, whether it's cloud or on-prem, it could be various cloud providers. We have a lot of customers that have, 2 or 3 different cloud providers, depending on where they are geographically. Allows you to have it where you can pick and choose what you want shared and replicated across your org, where you might have an organization, in San Francisco that does development, your QA organization, and your secondary round, follow the sun method of development in Bangalore. You might have another distribution or another development team in Moscow. It doesn't matter. You can share those binaries using replication in many different ways. So let me go in, and I'm going to actually give you the quick walkthrough of actual Artifactory itself. So let me log in. Oh, I'm actually in the wrong place. So let's try that again. Here we go. So this is Artifactory. If you're not used to it, or if you're used to it, I'm sorry, I'm going to go through this again. I'm going to give you my, as I call it, usually the 5-cent tour of what Artifactory is. And then we're going to go back to our presentation, and I'm going to talk about some more detailed components behind it. Let's take a look here. So what we have here is the dashboard, right? So when you come into Artifactory and you log in, this is what you see. Now, let's preface it by something quickly. So one of the things I want to preface quickly on this is that this is simply an Angular 2 application that rides on top of our API. So a lot of people come to us and they say, well, I want to automate this. I want to do things with it. I want to be able to, I don't want to use your UI. And that's fine. We're totally cool with that. But we have the tool set. And we're going to talk about the various tools later on in this conversation on what you can actually do with it. I'm going to give you a quick tour. I'm not going to go too detailed because if you want to do that, we have plenty of articles, we have plenty of information, or you can go back and watch one of the other 40 Intro to Artifactory videos that are out there. I decided, like I said, this is going to be slightly different. So over here, we have our quick search feature, and quick search allows you, of course, what does it do? It searches. So you can look for everything from archive searching to package types to checksum, whatever you want. It leads you directly into our search nav. Of course, we have our user guides and our API, and of course, Stack Overflow, every developer's best friend. You know, why fight it? Might as well use it. At the bottom, we have our row of helpful user guides that we've produced over time. You know, if basically, like I said, if you have questions, go in there. We're community supported. We monitor Stack Overflow. We help out where we can. Over here is we have the latest builds, and we're going to definitely take a deep dive into that because I think that's very valuable and important. And when I said in the beginning, we talked about having things like simplicity, ease of use, getting your organization on board, making sure that your organization is, can use this quickly and stuff is right here. So if you look, one of the things that we provide in the UI, at least, is the fact that we provide set me up instructions. So the set me up instructions is package dependent. So in other words, we provide the instructions that is for that package. So in this case, I'm showing Docker. Now I am going to show a bunch of Docker stuff in here because the reason why is this. I always like to show Docker because in a way it's the most complex you can get. It's made of varying package types. It's made of varying entities. It's you can use Artifactory as a Docker registry. So you actually can have your own Docker registry. But the thing is that you can use Artifactory along the whole lines of this. And I've got examples of this where I've actually got dependent builds where I'm actually building the components that are being put in those Docker containers. So in this case, I'm just showing you, once you set up Artifactory as your secure Docker registry, and you log in, it operates just like Docker itself. So you can tag, you can push, you can search, you can do all the Docker components through the Docker command line or automation that you can do. The only difference is you're proxying all those commands through Artifactory. And also too, something way more complex in this case. Let me see here. I'll find like Gradle. Right? So with Gradle, we can actually go through and give you all the options here. And we actually have it. So if you want, we create all those options to use Artifactory and all the dependencies around it for you. And you put it in and it's simple walkthrough. Like I said before, this is the build section. I'm actually going to spend some more time on that. We'll come back to that. But I'm going to give you a tour of the other forms and functions that are inside of Artifactory itself. So of course, the next tab we have here is, of course, the repository browser. This is where all your repositories are located. So you can see where in this case, I've got these Docker builds that I have here. And like I said, I'm going to talk about Docker. But if you look here, here's all the build information, right? So this is an automated Docker build that I did in Jenkins. And I'm going to show this to you. I'm actually going to show you the code, the infrastructure code that I put into Jenkins that actually produced this. And I have information about general information. We also have all the runtime tag environment information, right? What was executed at the time of its creation. One of the things, you can do is you have fine granular permission of access inside of Artifactory. And you can go through and assign things like, you want to have it so it's read only, or you want to have it so you can deploy. We have things like annotate. Annotate allows you to add additional metadata to any sort of build information. We have things like delete override. If you wanted to have somebody, limited production, limited information on who can do it, you can actually have it so that they can go through and delete, move, and binaries of those sorts. Of course, we have properties. Properties here are based on information like this, where I've got the build name, I've got the build number, and I can also add, if I wanted to, additional meta information around that also. Now, adding information to that is pretty straightforward and allows you to do that. And you can create watchers. In other words, if you want to see consumption rates or things like that. But also, too, I can also look at the build. So here's the build itself right here. Here's a link actually back to the job in my CI server. So I actually know where this originated from. And last, I could also see where it's being utilized. So actually, this build that I have here, I can tell you that it's actually been consumed by another step that I have in my pipeline, step 4. This was step 3, where I actually created the container. Step 4 is the consumption of this container, where I'm actually creating a Helm chart. Now we'll move on to the next thing. We just introduced in our latest set of releases the package native UI. Now, what is a package native UI? Well, just like it sounds like. If you're like, once again, Docker, we're going to go through on this, and I'm going to talk about is if you're used to using Docker, you know that Docker Hub has a specific UI that people are used to. Searching through Artifactory to find certain builds or to find certain images was a little daunting, so we addressed this by creating a user interface that is similar to the Docker Hub. So if I wanted to find, say, the Nginx Java, base image that I wanted, or Ubuntu, or actually in this case, here's my Docker container itself. One of the ones I created, right? That's the one I just discussed here. And we say, let me see the download count. I got 2 downloads on this one. So, wow, that's pretty cool. I can go in and take a look at, I can look at the manifest if I wanted to directly from here. I could also, if I wanted to, jump back into the browser and link it back in. And like I said, since this is all about accountability, it's about a single, source of truth, I can go in and look at the permissions. I can tell the job. I can see if it's been scanned, where it's been referenced. If you're using X-Ray for a security vulnerability, then we have it here. This has a critical issue. I might want to take a look at this in a bit. Now, here's our search functionality, right? So search functionality allows you to go through and pick package types. And, I want to go through and look at, like, say, the latest here or whatever. Oh, look, here's all my latest information. One of the things that we're going to talk about is AQL, and I'm going to kind of point to something quickly right now, just so you know that if you look at, I did the search, I used the UI for it. Well, if I want to reuse this, or I want to have it as part of an automated process, I can go in here and take a look. And we've actually taken that query string that we use ourselves, and we actually expose it for you. So if you wanted to make this into some sort of CLI command, you can make it into some sort of API command that you want to run. You can add it to your CI/CD system, and I'm going to show you an example of that also. But here's some generated AQL that you could take, pull it out, modify it, and then learn, maybe refine it to how your organization by adding additional metadata and properties and things like that. It's very a powerful tool, and I don't think we emphasize AQL enough in our CLI. And like I said, we'll talk about that. Last in here is release bundles, and this is actually one of the things we'll talk about. We'll kind of touch on towards the end with the introduction like a month and a half ago of our Enterprise Plus feature. The ability to combine varying package types together to create a release is part of our Enterprise Plus platform, and it's called a release bundle. And we can talk about that towards the end if people are interested. Now, the powerful portion of this that I really enjoy, and I always like to talk about, and always gives the best information is, yes, we have the dependencies, but what about the builds that are being produced inside of, say, a Docker app? So let's say with that Docker theme, I know you guys are sick of it, but that's okay. You're stuck with me for the next at least 45 minutes or so. So here we go. Here's a build that I did. And the Docker build I have here, I can show you how, we're storing all the metadata, right? So here's all the layers of this Docker container, as you can see here. I can go back and I can look at the contents. I talked about, I've got dependencies in these builds. So here's this Java, the Java web service that I created before that I was talking about. And then here's that Node.js front end that's being consumed to put into that. I can look at all the environmental variables that I have stored here. I can look at all the system variables, right? This is all from my CI environment. I mean, here it is. All that information is available. Everybody knows that stuff is available in Jenkins and Travis and TFS and VSTS. They're all available. But having it actually coalesced and consolidated into one location in a build structure allows you to have that single source of truth. So you're not hopping all over the place. Try to coordinate and figure out where it's coming from. I can also look at the issues that are available, that happen during the build process. I can also look at licensing. These don't have any licenses associated to it. That might be a red flag in my system. I can also, auto-find licenses. I can also look and say, include all the other licenses that are part of this. I'm going to show you a feature right now, though. And if you're familiar with any sort of complex or infrastructure components, things like Docker, where it's made of multiple pieces, moving parts, all these things. Well, wouldn't it be nice if you can do a diff between 2 builds to find out maybe why build A was successful and why build B failed? Well, because it's stored in Artifactory, you can go through and see what's changed, even in a complex thing like Docker, being able to see what's changed between 2 builds. So being able to say what at the artifact level has changed. I can tell you, and if you look here, by the way, you can see where we have the SHA values for the checksum in this case. But here's the layers that have changed, and here's the ones that haven't. Here's all the dependencies. In this case, not much has changed. But on the environmental variable level, I could tell you what's actually, maybe there was a change in the version of Java that happened, or the version of Docker that was used to compose this, or maybe the version of Jenkins was updated between these two builds. Maybe something changed. And I'll be able to actually have a smoother path to remediation because I have more metadata, I have more knowledge, I have more inherent ability to decipher what has happened than even going through a series of logs, in which I usually do. And once I discovered this, I realized that's another proof point I can use to help remediate something that's gone horribly wrong. One of the things that we're going to discuss today too is, and the importance of this, is promotion. So if you look here, this build was actually released. So it lets me know that this build went from one to another to another. Went through my chain, it went through my CI pipeline, it went from my developer to my staging to my release. Maybe I have more steps in between. And as stated before, we also have, everything's API driven. So if you wanted to pull this build info out, here's the raw JSON that we're displaying there. Now, I'm going to go through and do one more portion, one more walkthrough on this, and then I'm going to go back and I want to talk about some of the things that we're discussing here. Now, I'm going to do the overview here, and then I want to talk about repositories and what that means. I want to talk about, I'm going to point you guys to a white paper about naming conventions, because I think that's super important. I want to talk about repository structures, and actually next month sometime we're going to have one called Planning and Promotion. It's going to be a way for us to kind of go very deep in detail about how to use Artifactory as a way for us, having different repositories to handle different steps in your CI, and to use our promotion API to help facilitate that between all the varying steps you have. So let's talk about what's available here in the admin screen, and then we're going to jump into repositories. I'm going to talk about local, remote, and virtual. And then I'm going to talk about, and like I said, I'll go back to my presentation. So if you look here, we have the repository types, which we'll go back to. Generalized configuration, so if you have things like our X-ray product, you connect it here. Proxies, mailing, if it's high availability, how many are involved in this cluster. In the middle part, we have our security section on here. So this would be like users, groups, and permissions, and access tokens. We have tons of information about that. We could talk about that a little bit maybe towards the end, but really what it comes down to is go to the wiki. We have some information. It's a very standard use case that you would have for this. And then, of course, we have the authentication providers, and this is where you would do things like setting up your LDAP or your crowd or OAuth, whatever you have, and being able to put this in here. We also have the ability for backups and indexer, and then, of course, import and export of repositories or complete systems. And one of the funny things about this is that, if you need to quickly and you have permission and you have to this portion of Artifactory, one of the nice things we even do in this case is you can go into system logs, and you can actually watch all the fun log files go by. And so having to actually SSH into this, you can disable this, by the way, if you wanted to, SSH into it, and be able to look to see how things are functioning and acting. We have our Artifactory logs, access logs, and request logs. So it's all there. Now let's just take a step back for a minute, and let's go dive in and let's talk about repositories. Towards the end, if you guys have any questions, please feel free. We'll be taking questions at the end. There is a Q&A section, so if you wanted to go in and add those questions, and we can address them at that point. But let's talk about repositories. So usually I would have a slide at this point where I would show and say, I have a bunch of doors and I have a bunch of points that I'm showing off. But let's just talk quickly about them. So we have things like local repositories, which are the binaries that matter to you. Those are your builds. Those are the ones that maybe you put into your system that you want to utilize, such as maybe libraries that are used by other teams. Not only the builds you do, or maybe even ones you pulled from a remote repository that you consider approved. And then there's plugins for this. There's other things you can do. But Artifactory also, remember, we have tremendous amount of repository types. So let's just, in this case, I'm going to pick NPM, just because. So if I'm going to create an NPM, repository, I'm going to say NPM local, and as my test here, and if I actually spelled things correctly, it'd even be better. And if you're looking here, there's some features you have behind here, right? So you can actually use the default layout. Now, we say default layout means how those binaries are being stored in the actual repository itself, which is like path information. So it'd be like, or if you're used to Java, it'd be like org/com/blah, blah, blah. You can change that so it meets it. You can also have it so that you can enable X-ray to scan these for any sort of nefarious security vulnerabilities or things like that. And you can also go through and look at the advanced features. So you might want to create property sets. We'll touch on that briefly in a minute. And then, of course, replication. Now, replication, we have a tremendous amount of information on that. And I am going to cover that for a few minutes on my slides. Well, let's just create that. So now I actually have a local repository. And if I do npm, you can see it's right here, test npm local. That means that anytime I do a publish, like an npm publish or anything like that, I'm going to be storing it there. Let's go take a look at remote. Now, I need to make sure I want to proxy all the npm.js node modules that I depend on for my product through Artifactory, because I want to make sure I store those. I talked about left pad before and what a nightmare it was. So let's click on here, and I'm going to say test npm, and I'm going to say remote, just to say that's my remote. And if you look here, it's connected to registry.npm.js org. So that means that I am now, anytime an npm install comes in, and I have Artifactory set up as my npm registry, it's going to check locally to see if there's anything in the cache there first. If it's not, it'll go out and retrieve it and store it for me later. Now, I can also flag it so that I have it securely, I can have it checked to make sure that any vulnerabilities have been scanned. I can also replace the repository layout, and I can also do things like replication. So let's save that. I'm kind of speeding up a little bit because I realize that I am talking a lot and we're running out of time. But let's talk about virtual repositories. Now, virtual repositories are, you don't want to have a whole bunch of URLs of local and remotes and tons of repositories out there. So why not consolidate them into one? So we use virtual repository. I'm going to say npm, and I'm going to say virt for virtual repository. And let's do this. Let's take a look and filter out just the npm ones for expediency of time. Well, here's that local repository I created before. And here's that remote one I created. You know what, though? I actually have a dev organization that's actually making ones for me, and I'm actually going to utilize theirs also. So this might be another virtual repository. So I've got a virtual repository inside a virtual repository. Now, what I want to do is I want to make sure that maybe that other team has already grabbed dependencies of mine, so I could change the order. So now I'm actually going to have it check the other organization first before it goes out and tries the external. The version I have out, the external repo. And then I'm going to define, and I want to make sure that when I deploy things back into this repository, that I pick the local sense, because I want to make sure it's stored in my repo. Now, if I finish this, I've now created a virtual repository, and we go back to our set me up instructions that we had in the beginning. Let's filter on npm. And if you look here, here's my test virt. And now if I wanted to use npm, it's here. So now I've set it up, and I can do, like I said, npm login. I put it as part of my npm rc file. I can add it in, to either npm rc this way or this way. I can add it in as part of the package.json. And then if I do this, I can do npm publish, install, all the usual stuff that I want to do. But now the npm stuff that I'm building, I'm pulling and stuff is all done through Artifactory. All right, let's go back to my presentation for a quick sec. Like I said, I gave you the 5-cent tour, but we are kind of slightly running out of time. So I want to talk about some important things that, I talked about briefly for a minute. There's a white paper we have about topology, and I think it's very important that everybody out there reads it. When you're dealing with Artifactory, it'll go into greater detail than I'm explaining right now. But for replication is a way for you to have multi-site topologies around the world, around the globe, in your same hometown, whatever. But it's a way for you to share binaries between those locations and have it done in an efficient manner. So in other words, say you are doing Docker repositories for a service that you're doing. And I've got, I have all over the world, I've got data centers, and I've got people producing these. When people are uploading, say, backup or replication takes place, because everything is based on our checksum-based storage, the deltas are the things that get replicated. These are where binaries get, shared between organizations. This is where I might be a producer-consumer model where I've got one organization that produces for another. where, you know, I promote up some libraries that are consumed by somebody else. Well, I produce those and I publish them locally, but they can be replicated globally. So, you know, we'll kind of talk about that a little bit right now. And like I said, it's dependent on use case. So it's very highly flexible. It all depends on your org. Don't ever think we're going to lock you into a particular manner because, like I said, picture us as a massive tool set that you can utilize in your organization. So you have push replication, just as it says. You have one location that pushes out to another, right? You can have it event-based. You can have it scheduled. Now, we do have cleanup tasks that run. So in other words, say that you have low bandwidth or you have the latency of certain type where event-based may not be an option. You can schedule it out. So maybe every 12 hours, every hour, binaries get synchronized between the two. It is fast, it is fast, async, meaning that, because we do a check of checksums, we only move the ones that matter, right? The changes, we only move the deltas. So we have that on the push model. Of course, you have pull. So you might actually have a location where you do have that latency. And you might have it so that, maybe that is an inconsistent connection between the two. Maybe you don't have that. Well, here's the thing is that when you have that kind of model, it's almost better to have a cron job that runs and says, check my source. So it could be whatever you designate as the replication source on a regular basis. If there is a change, there is a delta between what I have and what's on the source, only pull the ones that matter at that time. So that gives you that ability, that flexibility to, to use either push or pull. Now, once again, you have event-based. So in other words, anytime there is a change on the repository, you can have it so that it synchronizes across, or like I said, you could do it on a time-based where you might have something with low latency or low bandwidth or things like that. You can handle things in a star topology where you designate a primary and then you have nodes that are around it. So in other words, anytime something is updated in, say, the primary node, it can be pushed out to the externals and vice versa. So in other words, it can be the remote sites pushing back into the central. And then also we have mesh topology. Now this is where mesh is more of like, it's you don't want to have any sort of circular pattern, but at the same time, it allows, any sort of contributing organization tool or anything like that to contribute that back in and have it actually shared throughout the entire org. So what does that mean? So that means you might have things where, if you look on my screen here, you have like 2 repositories in an A and B location, Amsterdam and Bangkok, where I have one virtual repository where I have 2 locals. I have a local here and a local here, but then I have remote set up so that these are always in constant synchronization. Or I might have multiple sites in this case, and I have one giant repository, that's for this package type. Remember, not a giant repository for everybody, but for these individual projects, those packages or things like that. But then having it so that they're all synchronized across your org. Next thing, since we are running low on time, is I want to make sure that everybody is aware of things that we do with tools and extensions. Now, when I say extensions, that could be things like plugins for, say, an IDE, or it can be our CLI, our API, our AQL, or like Jenkins plugin or VSTS. And the thing is you're not limited to just what those offer. You have the ability and the flexibility to go in and utilize different sets of tools for different types of jobs, what's dependent on you and your organization. So, we're going to start off with, once again, I keep bringing up metadata because I can't emphasize it enough. I think it's a very, it's a paramount portion of Artifactory and what it means to your organization and how to best utilize it to increase the efficiency in which you operate and make sure that it's very minimalistic in things that you do, but at least it's relevant to your org. By having that metadata drive it, it allows your automation to increase, and you can have audits, you can have ledgers, whatever you want. It's all there. So let's talk about Jenkins. Jenkins in this case, and our typical CI pipeline, just so you know, our typical CI system supports all this, right? So even if I say Jenkins, I could actually change this right now, and I can make a TFS. I can make a Circle CI, things like that. But allows you to connect to an instance of Artifactory and use that for not only the dependencies of uploading and downloading files using FileSec and also file specs and also AQL, but also publishing back to Artifactory for that single source of truth. You can promote builds from like one repo to another. So before, when I created that local, I actually might want to create one that says dev. I might want to create one that says staging. I might want to create one like that. Promoting that build allows you to have that system of record that a lot of organizations look for. Now, when it comes to this, but it's also fully REST API supported. So I'm going to show you some examples that I have in infrastructure as code, in which I'm using a combination of not only the plugin, but I'm using the API and the CLI. So this way, where it might be that the plugin doesn't fit the need of that step, where I might need to do some more manual manipulation to make sure that it fits my business model. So, there's things that we have inside of Artifactory that, we have our plugin architecture. So if you want to go take a look and read up on our plugin architecture, it allows you to even customize Artifactory even more. But the big thing is that having that full REST support via the API or the CLI with an enhancement to the way you utilize the build plugin allows you to have that more full breadth of knowledge and a better way for you to use Artifactory as that conveyor belt. Now, our REST API is, of course, it's fully scoped. So the thing is that you use any tool that you want to use in here. You can use, curl, whatever. If you have an advanced programming language, we have a certain customer that we deal with that they actually built their own cataloging system that uses Artifactory as the storage repository for all that, including metadata, the binaries, everything. And they've actually functionally written their own interface to it using the API. Now, there's a difference between, say, our CLI and the API, and I want to make sure people are aware of this, is our API is not checksum aware. It will send up the binaries, and then Artifactory will handle it. Our CLI tool, if we're utilizing it for uploads or manipulation or anything like that, is checksum aware. It is built into the product. So there is a difference there. So, to keep that in mind, just have it there. By the way, you can also use varying methods. So one of the things that I'll just show you quickly is, we mentioned here for, there's username, password, there's the API key and things like that. If we're using, say, our built-in security model, and I were to go to, say, my user that I have here, let's go take a look at my profile for a second. Oh, I might want to actually, get my password really quick for this. It's a generated password, so don't worry, I'll change it after this. Let's update the password. And if you look here, I actually have an API key, and like I said, this instance I'm running here, or I've also got an encrypted password. So if I want to use an encrypted password for any sort of testing like this, I don't have to use the actual API itself. You can also request this, by the way, by using the CLI if you wanted to, or you could actually do it via standard like API header. The CLI, like I talked about before, it's actually, you can download it for any platform. If you're using, say, a Mac, you can actually just use Brew. And by the way, just to keep you guys aware, that if anytime you're using Brew, you're actually interfacing with JFrog itself, because we host Brew actually is on our bin tray product. It's one of the open source initiatives that we back. And the thing is that you can utilize the CLI in many different methods and many different ways. Now you can use it for generalized information like uploading, downloading, moving files around, collecting information, whatever you need to do, you can clean. And also too, I showed you before that when I was running one of the pieces of this, you can, one of the most powerful features, in my opinion, anytime you do an API or a CLI or any call like that, is the ability to flag something with like a dry run. So we have, take a look at our documentation, dive into it, and you'll see in there that you can actually go through and utilize, dry run as a way to test before you do. It's always a good safety to have. This is the typical command structure you would use for the CLI. AQL I want to talk about for a minute. Now AQL is super powerful. I showed you the search feature that we had in the UI, and when I pulled it out, it generated a AQL query. Now, AQL, in this case, right, this allows you to go through and refine searches, pull binaries, pull artifacts, whatever you need to do in a very simple yet powerful language. It's very JSON-based when you look at it. It's very similar to that. So, you could do things like formulate and pull out things and filter. You can actually, you can pull out and utilize, I'm trying to think of the best way, basically properties. You can refine it so that you pull out the artifacts, the builds, the binaries that matter to you. You can execute it via the API, the CLI, whatever you need in that case. And then also, too, you make it part of your best practices schema and allowing you to utilize it for things like, I'm going to show you an example, actually, where when I'm composing when I'm composing one of my Docker containers, I'm using AQL to produce a file spec, and then that file spec is being used to actually pull the contents that I'm going to put in that Docker container for that Docker build. It's very simple and straightforward if you were to do it from a curl, but this is what a typical AQL query looks like. Item find, here's what you're looking for, so a statistic of downloads, and I want it greater than 5. I want to know what artifacts have been, anytime anything's been downloaded more than 5 times, I want to know, I want to look and find it. You can do complex searches. You can go through and do ands and ors. You can also do it. You take operators. You can go and use matches. You can, it's all very detailed in our documentation, and I know I'm going to go over in time, so I want to be able to get to the next part. Thank you for this portion of it, but let's do this. You know what? I'm going to switch over right now, and I am going to show you some fun stuff. So I'm just going to show you some sample, basically infrastructure-esque code in this case. So let's take a look at, like, say, each one of these that I have here is very different. So I have a infrastructure portion here where I'm actually utilizing, these are actually Groovy scripts. These are actually pipeline DSLs from Jenkins. And in here, I'm actually using the actual plugin. So once I have the plugin installed into Jenkins and my builds that I create, that I have, my scripts become aware of what Artifactory is. I could pass parameters, I could put in, API calls, whatever I want to do. And I could do that from inside of my code, my infrastructure as code. So in this case, I'm just utilizing it as a deployment tool, as a resolver, and I'm running it, right? So these are all standard calls. My next one is a little bit different. So in this case, I'm actually producing a UI in this case. And if you look here, I'm actually going to be I'm pulling down the JFrog CLI, and I'm utilizing the CLI to produce those same kind of facets where I'm not using the actual plugin itself, but I'm actually executing CLI commands. I'm going to move on to a different one I have over here, and if you look, I'm actually using the API in this case, and here's an AQL query that I created that I'm using this to actually create my file spec to actually to use in a step in my pipeline. And also above, I'm using actually the CLI tool here to perform functions also. So, having those multi-stage components, having the infrastructure code, being able to customize it and take my CI system, my CD system, whatever, and here's a deployment one. But having that set up, having that flexibility is a lot of things customers ask us about. They ask us, where does it go from here? How does that operate from here? And if we were to actually go in, I'm going to show you one more thing, and I'm going to bring it up right here. And we have these examples, by the way, readily available. And if I were to look at, say, some other things like scripting code that I have here, here's another example of where I might have some code that I'm deploying where I'm using a download spec, right? We talked about that. I'm composing the container. In this case, it's Docker build, and I'm publishing it back into Artifactory with all its build information. I'm actually performing tests on it, right? I'm pulling that container down, I'm tearing it apart, I'm beating it up, and if it works, I'm actually using the API, in this case, to put up additional metadata back into the system, letting you know it passed my tests, so if I need to find that, I can. I can also call it directly. I can do X-ray scanning directly from inline in my process to say, I want to go through and I actually want to scan this container down to its deepest level, because you never know what might be inside. I mean, I'll show you a quick example of that. I mean, here's, if I was actually logged in, here we go. I'll show you, I mean, this is the kind of stuff that you can find in here. Actually, we'll go back to a better one than that. Let me go in. We have only a few more minutes left, and I'm sorry, guys. But let me do this. But if I were to dive into this container, you can see where deep down in this, I've actually got a vulnerability right here. And the biggest thing is I talked about promotion. So I have a source repository and I've got a promotion repository. And being able to automatically say it passed my test, it's been security scanned, it's vulnerable, and now I want to promote it up.